screen, and if you can confirm that you can see this.
Yes. We can indeed.
Yeah. Perfect. So I'll try not to run too long, but of course I do get rather excited when I start talking. And I was trying to think, well, what do I want to say to you all? And it's all about context. So I started off in the middle there, you've got those beautiful nodules. These are nodules on which are marked with a gene on Phaseolus roots. But I started off from nodules, and I end up really working very much at global scale, thinking about food security. But if I have one message and one thought for you all, it's don't forget context. And I hope that resonates with all of us who've worked in the tropics. So I've worked on this problem. This is, in a sense, my signature slide, this overriding problem of poor soil fertility. Granite sand there in the foreground in Zimbabwe. Poor soil fertility. And what are the solutions? Well, of course, these wonderful nitrogen-fixing legumes. So legume green manures, tree fallows, forages, and particularly in the center there, the grain legumes. That's a picture of groundnut. So here we have groundnut in the glass house. This is actually a slide I took at ICRISAT in the early 1980s, showing groundnuts with rhizobium versus groundnuts without the rhizobium bacteria. We can do that in the field. These are slides from northeast Thailand where we were working. We'd got some genotypes of groundnut which couldn't form nodules. And I always say they're no use for the farmer, but they're absolutely fantastic when it comes to measuring nitrogen fixation in the field, because they can act as our reference plant. And if we zoom in, of course, here's a groundnut root system. You can see the nodules all over the roots. Yeah, here down on the roots. If we zoom in again, this is now a transverse cross-section through a root. The root up to the left, it's cut through the nodule. You can see these densely stained cells in the middle, which are there full of these bacteroids. This is transmission electron microscope. And here we've got basically the nucleus, the vacuole, and all these little circular bacteroids in cross-section, which in a scanning electron micrograph, here they are, the bacteroids, modified bacteria, they're present in the nodule, these fantastic things that can fix nitrogen and really then put, if you like, protein into the mouths of farmers. Now, I was just checking out, I wrote this book published by CABI in 1991 at the tender age of 34 when I was at Y College. Second edition I wrote when I was a professor at the University of Zimbabwe. The third edition never happened, but who knows, maybe in future. But I've worked then on these legumes, fantastic things. But here we are in the field in Zimbabwe on these really poor granite sands, here with a group of eminent visitors. Here we've got Tim Reeves, the DG of CIMMYT, visiting participatory work with smallholder farmers. And you can see it's a total disaster, a total embarrassment, because essentially the soils are so poor that the legume green manures won't grow. And I think it was actually triggers around this that made me realize that this issue of soil fertility is, of course, one of management. And in this slide, if we look towards the house, you can see close to the house, we've got this beautifully well-managed fertile soil with the food security crop, where we've actually got as much soil organic matter you'll find just about in any soil in Africa. And then within 50 meters, we've got the most depleted soil because nothing's been put back in that soil, which is probably about the worst soil we can find in Africa. So we've got that all in a microcosm. And this led me, when I moved to Wageningen, to really start thinking much more about what causes these problems. And we set up this program, I called it Nuances, so nutrient use in animal cropping systems, efficiency scales, but it's basically looking at trade-offs. Why do farmers do some things in parts of their farms and others in other parts of their farms? And I summarize that, and here we've got the household, we've got the vegetable patch, we've got the infield close to the house, we've got the outfield. We've got livestock roaming around, producing manure, of course, grazing in common rangelands. The livestock, we've got small farms as well, so poorer farmers. Here's just a small farm with just a poor field compared to this wealthier farmer. We've got livestock which are grazing all of the crop residues, producing manure. That manure is then focused back onto the fields close to the household. We've got compost and things coming from the household into the home garden. If farmers have fertilizer, they also go onto the food security crop, leaving these other fields then very depleted, but still sown. We've got export of crops to the market or for sale. We've got some other inputs coming into the farm. But when we're thinking about technologies and where do they fit, here's our basket of options to address soil fertility, all the different legumes, manure, fertilizers. It's got to fix within this sort of complexity that we face. So we developed this farm scale model so we could look at different simulations of crop soil interactions, the interactions with livestock through the manure back to the fields, the household decisions, and we could actually explore issues to do with climate, markets, the use of common resources off farm, remittances coming into the farm. And this for me was the beauty of moving to work in Wageningen, where we had a whole team of people who could do this work around systems analysis. And I was coming from a very empirical background to join them. Now, this led me on. This is actually a slide from a talk I gave in 2007, where we started to then think about how do we fit technologies there, moving away from this idea of the silver bullets to the best fits. How can we fit technologies to fit within these farming systems? Here's one example. This is John Ojem in Western Kenya, testing out a whole range of legumes. We've got Acrotalaria ocraluca here, mucuna, soybean, and others. And here's a farmer who sees this wonderful canavalia, actually, sword bean green manure in a field. And she says, but what can I use this for? I can see that it grows very well. If my maize is here, you know, it's yellow. I think you're cheating on me. You must be coming in, putting fertilizer on during the night because it's so dark green. And we explain this wonderful benefit of nitrogen fixation that can contribute to the soil. But she says, yeah, but I've got hungry mouths to feed. And when you've got emaciated children walking through your green manure plots, you start to realize that farmers need grain legumes. They need immediate benefits. They can't wait for these longer term benefits that we can get from these technologies like green manures. And that led us to think about this idea of the niche. So here in ecological terms, this hyperdimensional hyperspace that defines where something fits. And we were always thinking in our agroecological terms of climate, soil, agroecological zone, cropping system. But of course, we've got to think of labor, economics, the substitution. If you grow one thing, you can't grow another. The investment. And so we came up with this idea of course, the niche having agroecological and socioeconomic dimensions. So a socio-ecological niche. And this has really driven my thinking very much as we went forward. So from that conference in Arusha, a young lady came up to me and she said, do you remember me, Ken? You taught me nitrogen fixation at Y College when I was doing my master's. And this was a lady called Yvonne Pinto, who was then working at the Gates Foundation. Now she's DG of IRI in the Philippines. And Yvonne said, we should go and talk. So we went and had dinner. And after a number of workshops and about a year and a half's work, I started with a project, this one, which I called End to Africa, putting nitrogen fixation to work for smallholder farms in Africa. And that took actually up 10 years of my career, 11 countries, $52 million of Gates money, in fact, where we were looking at promoting these technologies of climbing beans here in Rwanda, soybean in northern Ghana. Here we've got multi-purpose cowpea in northern Nigeria, soybean in northern Nigeria. So we were looking, though, specifically at grain legumes because of their benefits, direct benefits for food, for cash, and of course, for soil fertility. Now, this project led us in many, many directions. Here we are with our knowledge, but then working with Shuja's comics, working with Farm Radio International, with Farm Radio putting out messages that farmers were actually then asked to send back text messages to Farm Radio International to their hangar in Arusha if they actually had questions or things that they wanted to raise. That allowed then surveys of follow-up with thousands of farmers where we could identify what were the needs of farmers in the field. And then we could actually liaise with the agro dealers and working with AFAP here to actually bolster extension services and to try and make sure that the varieties that farmers wanted in terms of seed and the inputs were there in the shop at the right time. Again, this was with CABI through their soil health team in terms of collaboration. And we were successful in many ways. This was a prize that we won on the Harvesting Nutrition Prize. Down at the bottom here, our work in 11 countries, because we were showing that if we were doing our extension work with women farmers, that actually had direct benefits in terms of consumption and diversification of diets. Whereas if we worked through the men, it tended to go into income, and that was much less direct in terms of the nutritional benefits at household level. Now, this is the background, in a sense, of what we developed as an approach to our farming systems research. We call it the deed cycle, a co-learning cycle, where whenever we go into a new place, we try and understand to describe the background of the background history of the local system, where things are coming from, understanding the constraints and the problems. We then go through this experimental phase with experiments on farm, working on yield gaps causes, using simulation models, trying to understand the benefits and problems of all the different approaches, whether it's integrated soil fertility management, IPM, conservation agriculture, you name it. Then taking that into this idea of understanding the trade-offs and synergies to explore possible futures, and then to come up with designs together with farmers for new configurations, new landscape arrangements, which could actually address the local situation. So an iterative cycle of co-learning. And this then leads us to this idea that we've got our technologies, so in a sense, there are sort of square pegs, or we've got this farmer diversity at the bottom, different types of farms. Somewhere in the middle, we've got this suitability where the square peg meets the square hole of the right size. And of course, the environmental factors, agroecological, socio-cultural, institutional, economic, they're actually shaping the farm factors and types, as well as filtering, if you like, the technologies. But this idea then that silver bullets really don't work, but we have techniques to unpack the diversity and how we can try and then match the right technologies to the right situations for different types of farmers. Now, last year in April, I actually traveled from Mbeya in Tanzania all the way down to Lilongwe by car, and I was actually astounded to see what was happening in terms of what I termed then this soybean revolution in Malawi. And actually, I was on my way to see Stephen Carr, who was mentioned earlier, and I managed to get to Blantyre, who was already in a nursing home, and he passed away not long after that, in fact. So in the field, though, we see this revolution of soybean. Now, the work that we'd done actually with the Rockefeller Foundation in Malawi in the early 1990s, soybean was an unknown crop. It wasn't there at all. But all of a sudden now we see soybean taking over. And to actually show this, you can see then the production now is up to nearly 250, nearly 300,000 tons of soy. And when we look at where it's been grown, it's actually replacing tobacco as a cash crop. You can see it's actually in the tobacco growing areas that soybeans really expanding. And what I like to use with this example is this idea, well, actually, we did all that research in the past and soybean wasn't taking off at all, right through the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, until the conditions became right, which it really has taken off as a cash crop for smallholder farmers. Here we've got a farmer bringing a bag of soy. She had only 3 kilos here. She drops it on a scale. She's paid immediately. She takes the kwacha off to the market to buy the food for the evening. That's consolidated then by these young men who are employed by traders to take that over to the local growth point along the main road, and then that's shipped off to the processing plant. And this is, I think, a great example of a crop which is then being used for all sorts of purposes. Here for these soy extrusion to actually make soy meals, which are then sold in all the supermarkets now. We find this throughout Africa as a sort of fast food. There's a meat substitute. There's soy oil, locally produced on the shops in the market. And I should mention here, this is Frederick Kawalewale, who we actually helped to set up his inoculant business to actually produce rhizobium inoculants during our Into Africa phase, which was going very slowly then, but over then the past years since we were there, it's really taken off. And for me, it's an example of things you can do in the past really then can take off way into the future. Now, actually, in the eye of the time, I'm going to skip over this and maybe save it for later. I wanted, though, just to give a few thoughts. And I was asked to think about the new TAA and your new strategy. I confess to having been a member of TAA for many years, having actually given up my membership for a while, a bit in frustration at the way I saw the organization going. And I could discuss that at length, but I'm great to see now this new invigorated organization. I was particularly struck by an article in the latest issue of Ag for Development by Jim Harvey, David Ratcliffe and Paul Harding, which was a reflection on the DFID white paper. And I just wanted to take this example to reflect on that, because I've done a lot of thinking and discussion and writing actually around this idea of politics of knowledge in agriculture research with colleagues from IDS, Jim Sundberg, who's also retired now in particular. So we tend to be talking all the time now very much around the NGO community in Africa about regenerative, organic, agroecological, traditional, indigenous, alternative family farming. We juxtapose that against this idea of industrial, large-scale or conventional farming. But when we actually ask this question, what is conventional agriculture? And Jim Sundberg and I published a paper on that in a couple of years ago in Global Food Security. Well, of course, it's nearly all the farms in the world. 99% of the farms are really conventional family farms. But we're being pushed all the time to be going agroecological. Here we are, the high-level panel of experts. And this particularly in these 13 principles, most of these we could agree with, I think, completely. Fairness, participation, land and natural resource government, these are very normative principles we would all go along with. But there's one here that I really have problems with, and that's one of input reduction. And last week, I was actually in Brussels speaking to the Belgian Development Corporation, specifically about this paper that we just published, together with many colleagues from CIRAD. The input reduction principle is wrong when it comes to mineral fertilizers in Sub-Saharan Africa, because all my experience would tell me that legumes can do so much with nitrogen fixation, but we still need phosphorus, we still need potassium, we need more inputs, because production continually on soils with nothing returned is actually a best way to destroy your soils. And mineral nutrients from fertilizers are absolutely needed to sustain those soils and to build soil health. But I like to use this because here's a an example of a paper published in Outlook on Agriculture. You could argue a very obscure journal, but it's one which is really having impact together with our policymakers in different governments. And I would really encourage TAA to engage much more in those discussion and debates in the UK, because development cooperation in Europe is at a very low ebb in terms of support from different governments. And I think this is an area where we can really push hard in terms of messaging into policy. So I like to use this cartoon. It's a cartoon where we see this sort of populist world. Everybody's pushing for soil health, for agroecology, and they're coming to this point, this crossroads, where they have to make decisions, but most people are simply turning left, going along with this very populist agenda of, you know, the sound bites, where actually our role, I think, as scientists and educators is to grapple with complexity, to grapple with this complex, tortuous path up the hill, to take these decisions, which are much harder to communicate, but really the decisions that need to be taken and pushed into the policy agenda. So to finish then, my idea here really is, well, tropical agronomy, I think, is very much at a crossroads. I think the scale of the challenges we face in humanity is very, very daunting, and society has to make some very difficult choices on complex questions. We know how to close yield gaps, to double food production in Africa. We know that getting technology to work, though, is all about context, and it's not about simple silver bullets that we can promote everywhere. I think the land use pressures in Africa, and this I couldn't go into now, but we can show that the average farm size, the median farm sizes in Africa now are way below 1 hectare. Stephen Carr wrote a wonderful piece, the last piece, and I helped him to publish that, called Surviving on Half a Hectare of Land, how a family can't actually make a living because of the land use pressure. Put that together with climate change, and I think we're really heading for very, very difficult times in Africa, which need to be addressed very quickly. And I think my message to us all is, well, be active. We need to be engaged. We've got to be heard. But our arguments should be very much be based on science and not on emotions. And with that, I'd like to just finish by thanking some colleagues, particularly my colleagues in Africa, for the inspiration and collaboration, all the people I've been able to work with. And I think very much to the privilege of being paid largely by the public purse to serve at different universities and to actually pursue my own passion through my career, because I think that is a true privilege that I, and I think many of you listening to me from TAA, from knowing something of your own histories, is something that you've also had the privilege of as well. And my very last slide is to direct you to this website, Table Debates, which is run by the Oxford Martin School together with the Swedish University in Uppsala and Wageningen, where we try and actually have much more dialogue around food, the evidence, assumptions, values underpinning food systems and controversies. So thanks very much, and I hope I haven't kept you too long from your dinners. And with that, I'll cut this presentation and stop sharing my screen.
Just for the record, we are presenting you with your award. That way. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Come to you somehow.
Yeah.
Okay. Cheers.
Hold it again.
Oh, again?
Yeah, I have the camera.
Okay.
Yeah. Very nice, thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed.
Excellent. Ken, will you take a few questions?
I'd be happy to. And like I say, I don't need to keep you all from dinner, and I really regret the fact that I'm not there to enjoy with you.
We want to book you to come. How often are you likely to be in UK in the next year?
There's a meeting of the British Ecological Society in June I hope to be at. I will be there for Christmas, but that's up in the Peak District with the family. So
Well, can we try and book you when you're over in June to talk?
I would love
further?
to, Andrew. Absolutely.
Good. Well, we'll write to you and we'll try and identify a date, and we'll probably ask you to give a Ralph Melville Memorial Lecture.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Good. So, can I just ask one question, and I'll ask others to ask whether they have questions. At the moment, we seem to be faced with a situation where opinion, and whose opinion, is more important than fact. Have you found any way of combating that?
I mean, I think that in a sense, this is a lot of what I'm trying to speak to with those final slides when I'm talking about engagement with policy. Because certainly here in the Netherlands, you know, the meeting we had in Brussels with the Brussels Development Corporation with many NGOs, all of them are pushing Africa has to be agroecological. Now, that's fine for many things, I think, because a lot of what we do in agroforestry and intercropping, everything is very agroecological. But when it comes to saying, oh, we can't then use fertilizers, we're trying very much, I think, to project our views into Africa rather than asking what do people in Africa want. Then I think it becomes very difficult. Now, what do we do about it? I find it's about messaging, and it's not doing it once. It's doing it many, many times. It's a matter of a continuing voice, because the voice of many of these NGOs is very attractive for people, and certainly in the Netherlands, you know, the idea of fertilizer is you know, I was advising a foundation today, and one of the people say, but fertilizers poison the soil, don't they? And I think, well, no, they don't, not if they're used well. So how do we address a situation where facts and science really are not respected anymore? I think we have to claim that ground, Andrew. I think I just feel passionately we've got to be heard much more. And I would hope that TAA, with all of your history and your connections, certainly must be in a position to do that in the UK.
Thank you. Any other questions at this stage?
Very quick one, Andrew, if I'm allowed, from a distance.
From the distance, yes.
Thank you very much, Ken. Spot on. How do we harness farmers' experience who know full well that fertilizers in moderation do work and silver bullets don't?
Well, I would say if we do problem analyses with farmers in very many different places, what we tend to find is that you say, list of priorities, what do you want? Very, very often the hand goes up, we want access to fertilizer.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in Africa, that's still a huge problem, but that's a lot to do with prices and policies. And I often feel, and I've often said this, I spent most of my career working on a problem which really shouldn't exist, because it's back in the 1980s, actually, rates of fertilizer use were higher than they are today. But then structural adjustment came in, and all of a sudden we had to remove all of the support to farmers, just about. And that has actually led to declines in fertilizer use. And I think that's led to the crisis of soil health that we find in Africa today. But I've got another manuscript coming on that I hope to be able to share by early next year. Yeah.
Great.
Any others? Ken, can we thank you again and congratulate you and say that we'll let you off for an early dinner if you will come and talk to us at greater length in June, where we might want to put a few ideas before you for your
I'd love
comments.
to. Sure. And maybe what I'd just finally say, maybe, you know, obviously for me, being I'd say an economic and academic refugee, it's great to engage with the UK again. And maybe we can do something to try and encourage a slightly broader European arm into TAA, and I'll put my mind towards that.
Excellent. Thank you very much.